They thought he was a trespasser until the dean walked in and said the one sentence that froze the entire university hall. The security officer tightened his grip on the tall black man's arm as the heavy glass doors of Harrington Hall swung open and closed behind passing students. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows and painted long pale lines across the polished marble floor. Conversations faded one by one as curious eyes turned toward the quiet confrontation unfolding near the entrance. The man did not resist. He simply stood there with calm shoulders and steady eyes, holding a worn leather notebook against his side as if the moment did not belong to him at all. The officer spoke again, louder this time, his voice sharp enough to echo across the lobby. "Sir, you cannot remain in this building. Faculty access only." A few students slowed their steps, pretending to check their phones while secretly watching. A girl near the staircase whispered to her friend that she had never seen this man before. Another student quietly began recording on his phone. The man glanced around the lobby once, taking in the tall banners that celebrated decades of academic excellence. His gaze lingered for a moment on the large university seal embedded in the marble floor beneath his feet. He breathed slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if he had stood in places like this many times before. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The officer shifted his stance and spoke into the radio clipped to his shoulder, requesting backup even though the man had not raised his voice or taken a single step toward the restricted hallway. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. The man's name was Marcus Hale, though no one in the lobby knew it yet. To them, he looked like an outsider who had wandered into a place meant for professors and visiting scholars. His dark jacket carried the faint creases of travel, and his shoes were dusted with the chalky gray powder of the campus sidewalks. Nothing about him looked dangerous, yet the silence around him carried that familiar weight, the quiet suspicion that follows a person when others believe he does not belong. Marcus looked toward the long corridor that led deeper into the university. Somewhere beyond those walls, a lecture hall was filling with faculty members and graduate students preparing for a special academic event. He had come to attend that gathering. In fact, he had come for a reason that would soon change the entire atmosphere of this building. But for now, the only thing anyone saw was a black man being held by campus security while whispers drifted across the marble lobby like cold wine through an open doorway. The quiet tension inside Harrington Hall grew heavier as the security officer kept his hand firmly around Marcus Hale's arm. Students gathered in loose clusters near the tall pillars and along the staircase that curved up toward the faculty wing. Their voices stayed low, but their eyes stayed fixed on the scene unfolding near the entrance. The marble floor reflected the pale evening light from the high windows, and the polished surface made every small movement seem louder than it really was. The officer glanced again at Marcus, as if waiting for him to argue, but Marcus remained calm. He stood upright with his shoulders relaxed and his expression steady, holding the worn leather notebook against his side. A faint crease formed between the officer's brows. He was used to confrontations. Most people protested when they were told to leave a building. Some raised their voices. Some tried to explain themselves. Marcus didn't either. He simply looked around the lobby as though studying it. His eyes drifted slowly across the banners hanging from the ceiling that celebrated past academic achievements. His gaze paused briefly on a framed photograph of the university's first graduating class nearly a century earlier. Then he looked back toward the corridor that led to the lecture hall where the special event was about to begin. The officer cleared his throat and tightened his grip slightly. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time, step outside. This area is restricted for faculty and registered guests. If you do not cooperate, we will need to escort you out of the building." The words carried farther than the officer intended. Several students near the staircase turned completely around now, their curiosity openly visible. One young man whispered that the lecture tonight was supposed to be important. Another student said she heard the event was connected to a new research center being announced. A third student quietly asked why the man near the door was being removed. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "I told you already. I am here for the lecture. The officer studied him carefully. His eyes moved over Marcus's jacket, his shoes, the notebook in his hand. None of it looked official enough to convince him. Do you have identification, sir? Marcus shook his head slowly. I left it in my car. The officer gave a short nod, as if that answer confirmed everything he suspected. Without identification, you cannot remain inside the faculty building. Please come with me. Marcus did not move right away. Instead, he looked once more at the large university seal embedded in the marble floor. The gold lettering caught the light from the windows and glowed softly beneath his feet. For a moment, it looked as if he might say something else, but instead he simply breathed in slowly and nodded. All right. The officer motioned toward the glass doors. Let us go outside and sort this out. As they began walking across the lobby, the quiet crowd parted slightly to give them space. Some students stepped aside politely. Others leaned forward just enough to keep watching. One girl lowered her phone after recording several seconds of the encounter and whispered that the situation felt strange. Marcus walked calmly beside the officer without pulling away. The soft sound of their footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Just before they reached the doors, another security officer approached from the hallway, responding to the earlier radio call. He stopped beside them and looked at Marcus with the same cautious expression. What's going on here? The first officer answered without slowing his pace. Unauthorized individual in the faculty building. Escorting him out. The second officer nodded once and positioned himself near the doors to open them. Outside, the fading sunlight stretched across the wide campus lawn. Students crossed the pathways carrying backpacks and books, unaware of the quiet tension building inside Harrington Hall. Marcus glanced briefly through the glass at the familiar campus beyond the doors. The sight of the old brick buildings and tall oak trees stirred a memory that passed across his face almost too quickly to notice. Then something unexpected happened. A voice from the staircase spoke up. Wait a second. The officers turned toward the sound. A young woman stood halfway down the curved steps with a puzzled look on her face. She stared at Marcus as though she was trying to remember something important. The lobby fell silent again as everyone looked toward her, and Marcus slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. The young woman on the staircase did not move right away. She simply stood there with one hand resting on the wooden railing, her eyes fixed on Marcus Hale as if she were trying to place a memory that refused to settle. The two security officers paused near the glass doors and turned toward her. The first officer frowned slightly. Miss, please step aside. We are handling a security matter. The woman shook her head slowly. Her voice carried clearly through the tall lobby. I am sorry. I just thought I recognized him. The words drifted across the marble floor and settled into the silence that had already formed around the scene. Marcus looked up toward her calmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman descended a few steps, still studying his face. Several students nearby leaned closer to listen. The second security officer shifted his stance near the door, his hand resting casually near his radio. Marcus spoke quietly. It is all right. You probably have me confused with someone else. The woman tilted her head slightly as if testing that possibility. Maybe, but you look familiar. Her voice carried curiosity rather than accusation. The first officer cleared his throat. Miss, this individual does not have identification and is not authorized to be inside the faculty building. We're escorting him outside. That explanation seemed to settle the situation for most of the students watching. A few of them nodded, as though the matter now made sense. The woman hesitated for another moment before stepping down one more stair. Marcus gave her a small, polite smile, the kind someone offers when they know a misunderstanding will not be corrected right away. The officers resumed walking toward the doors. The large glass panels reflected the scene back at them as they crossed the lobby. Outside, the campus lawns stretched wide beneath the late afternoon sky. Leaves from the tall oak trees drifted slowly across the pathways where students walked between buildings. Marcus could see the old clock tower in the distance rising above the red brick rooftops. For a brief second, something in his expression softened, as if the familiar view stirred a quiet memory from years earlier. The first officer noticed the glance and followed his line of sight through the glass doors. Nice campus, is it not? Marcus nodded gently. It is. The officer pushed the door open and cool autumn air swept into the lobby. A few dry leaves skittered across the stone steps outside. As they stepped toward the doorway, another voice echoed from deeper inside the hall. Hold on. Both officers turned again. This time the voice belonged to a man standing near the faculty corridor. He wore a tweed jacket and carried a folder of lecture notes beneath one arm. Several graduate students followed behind him. The professor paused when he saw the officers escorting Marcus toward the exit. His eyes moved slowly from the security officers to the tall man beside them. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to speak. Then he stepped forward a few paces. Excuse me, what is going on here? The first officer answered quickly. Unauthorized visitor in the faculty building. We are escorting him outside. The professor looked at Marcus again. Something about the calm posture and the quiet dignity in the man's expression seemed to stir uncertainty in him. Marcus did not interrupt. He simply stood there, the worn leather notebook still resting against his side, his eyes patient and steady. The professor opened his mouth as if he were about to ask another question, but then hesitated. Around him, the students who had gathered in the lobby watched closely. The situation had become more than a simple security matter now. Curiosity rippled through the small crowd. The professor studied Marcus one more time before finally speaking again. Sir, were you here for the lecture this evening? Marcus nodded slightly. Yes, that was the plan. The professor glanced toward the hallway behind him where the lecture hall doors stood partially open. Voices from faculty members inside drifted faintly into the lobby. He looked back at the officers, uncertain. The first officer shook his head firmly. Without identification, he cannot remain inside the building. The professor exhaled slowly, still unsure what to make of the moment. Marcus remained silent, his calm presence only deepening the strange tension that now hung in the air. Outside, the sunlight had begun to fade behind the tall trees, and the long shadows stretching across the campus seemed to hint that something unexpected was about to unfold. The professor stood still for several seconds after Marcus answered his question. The hallway behind him carried the soft echo of faculty members gathering inside the lecture hall, their conversations blending with the distant hum of the building ventilation system. The professor adjusted the folder beneath his arm and studied Marcus more carefully now. Something about the situation did not sit comfortably with him. Marcus did not look lost. He did not look nervous. He looked like someone who had come exactly where he intended to be. The first security officer noticed the hesitation and spoke again, his voice steady and official. Sir, we have already explained the situation. Without identification, he cannot remain in this building. We will handle it outside. The professor nodded slowly, but his eyes did not leave Marcus. He stepped a little closer. His shoes made a soft tapping sound against the marble floor. May I ask your name? Marcus answered calmly. Marcus Halle. The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment. The professor searched his memory as though the sound of it stirred something familiar, but the connection did not form. He nodded politely. Well, Mr. Hale, if you were invited to attend the lecture, then perhaps we can sort this out quickly. Do you happen to have the invitation with you? Marcus gave a small apologetic smile. I am afraid it was sent to my email. The officer beside him let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a sigh. That is not going to help us right now. He gestured toward the open doors again. Please step outside with us. Marcus did not argue. He simply shifted his notebook slightly under his arm and walked forward with them. The professor remained where he stood, watching the three men move slowly across the lobby. Around them, the group of students had grown larger. Word had quietly spread that something unusual was happening in Harrington Hall just before the evening lecture. Several students stood near the staircase, pretending to read messages on their phones while clearly listening to every word. The young woman from the staircase had reached the bottom step now. She stood beside the railing with her arms loosely folded, still studying Marcus with that same puzzled expression. The security officers guided Marcus toward the glass doors again. As they reached the entrance, the cool breeze outside pushed gently through the opening, stirring the banners hanging from the high ceiling. Marcus paused for just a second before stepping through the doorway. His eyes drifted once more across the university seal beneath his feet. The gold letters seemed to glow against the polished stone. The officer noticed the pause and spoke in a slightly softer tone this time. "Look, sir, this is nothing personal. We just have procedures to follow." Marcus nodded. "I understand." The officer opened the door wider and motioned for him to continue outside. Just as Marcus stepped onto the stone landing outside Harrington Hall, another voice echoed from deeper inside the building. The sound carried authority even before the words became clear. "What exactly is happening here?" The voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that naturally pulled attention toward it. Conversations in the lobby stopped immediately. Students turned toward the long hallway that led to the administrative offices. The professor near the corridor straightened slightly when he heard it. The security officers paused near the doorway and looked back inside. A tall figure had appeared at the far end of the hall, walking steadily toward the lobby. The polished floor reflected the slow-measured steps as the person approached. Faculty members standing nearby moved aside respectfully as the figure passed them. The professor near the corridor recognized him instantly and lowered his voice. "That is the dean." A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the students gathered in the lobby. The two security officers exchanged a brief glance before turning to face the approaching figure. Outside the building, Marcus stood on the stone landing beneath the fading evening light. From where he stood, he could see the tall clock tower rising above the campus trees and the wide lawn stretching toward the main gate. He heard the shifting murmurs from inside the lobby and slowly turned back toward the doorway just as the dean stepped fully into view. The murmur that had filled Harrington Hall moments earlier faded into complete silence as the dean walked into the lobby. His footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, steady and unhurried, yet carrying the kind of authority that made people step aside without being asked. Students moved away from the center of the lobby, forming a quiet path between the staircase and the entrance doors. The professor, near the corridor, straightened his jacket and nodded respectfully as the dean approached. The two security officers at the doorway also shifted their posture, their earlier confidence replaced with a hint of uncertainty. Outside on the stone, landing Marcus Hale had just turned back toward the entrance when he heard the movement behind him. The cool evening air brushed lightly against his face as he paused and looked through the glass doors. Inside the building, the tall figure of the dean was now clearly visible beneath the soft lights of the lobby ceiling. The dean stopped several steps away from the officers and looked around the room once before speaking again. His voice remained calm, but carried clearly through the quiet space. I asked a question. "What exactly is happening here?" The first security officer cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. "Sir, we encountered an individual inside the faculty building without identification. We are escorting him outside according to campus policy." The dean followed the direction of the officer's gesture, and his eyes settled on the man standing just beyond the doorway. Marcus remained still on the stone landing, his notebook tucked calmly beneath his arm. For a moment, the dean simply looked at him. There was no anger in his expression, only careful attention. Inside the lobby, several students leaned forward slightly, sensing that something important was about to unfold. The professor who had spoken earlier remained near the corridor, watching with the same uneasy curiosity that had begun to spread through the room. The young woman who had come down from the staircase stood quietly near the railing, her eyes shifting between Marcus and the dean. The security officer spoke again, trying to keep his explanation precise. "The individual claims he is here for the lecture tonight, but he cannot provide identification, and we have no record of his registration at the entrance desk." The dean nodded slowly while listening. Then he took a few steps closer to the doorway. The polished floor reflected his dark shoes and the long shape of his coat as he approached. Outside, Marcus watched him calmly, showing no sign of impatience or embarrassment. He simply waited. The dean stopped just inside the doorway where the evening light from outside met the warm lights of the lobby. For a second, the two men looked at one another through the glass. Then the dean pushed the door opened, and stepped onto the stone landing beside Marcus. The quiet crowd inside the lobby watched closely. The security officers remained just inside the entrance, unsure whether to continue their escort or step back. The dean looked at Marcus with the careful expression of someone confirming a long, suspected recognition. The breeze moved lightly through the entrance, stirring the banners overhead and carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves from the campus lawn. Marcus offered a small, respectful nod. "Good evening." The dean's expression changed almost instantly. The uncertainty disappeared, and a look of clear recognition replaced it. For a brief moment, he seemed genuinely surprised. Then he let out a quiet breath that carried both relief and disbelief. "Well, I will be." His voice softened slightly as he spoke again. "Marcus Hade." The name rolled through the quiet entrance like a ripple across still water. Inside the lobby, several students exchanged confused glances. The officers near the door looked at one another, unsure what the moment meant. The dean turned toward them with a calm but unmistakable seriousness in his voice. "Why exactly are you escorting one of our most important guests out of this building?" For several seconds after the dean spoke, no one inside Harrington Hall moved. The words hung in the air like a sudden shift in gravity. The two security officers stood frozen just inside the doorway, their earlier confidence quietly dissolving as the meaning of the dean's question settled in. Students along the staircase exchanged startled glances. The professor near the corridor slowly lowered the folder he had been holding as he tried to process what he had just heard. Outside on the stone landing, Marcus Hale remained calm, his posture unchanged, his worn leather notebook still tucked beneath his arm. The dean turned slightly toward him, a warm expression replacing the earlier seriousness on his face. "Marcus, I was beginning to think you had decided not to come after all." Marcus gave a small, polite smile. "Traffic on the highway was heavier than expected, and I parked farther from the building than I remembered." The dean let out a quiet laugh that carried easily through the open doorway. "That sounds like this campus. It grows a little more complicated every year." Then his attention returned to the officers standing nearby. The warmth faded from his voice, replaced with firm clarity. "Gentlemen, this is Dr. Marcus Hale. He is the keynote speaker for tonight's lecture and the visiting scholar whose research program this entire event was organized around." A ripple of astonishment moved through the lobby. Several students straightened immediately, whispering to one another as they realized what the dean had just revealed. The professor near the corridor blinked in surprise, suddenly recognizing the name that had almost surfaced in his memory earlier. "Of course," he said softly to himself, his voice barely audible over the murmurs around him. The security officer closest to the door swallowed once before speaking. "Sir, we were not aware." The dean raised one hand slightly, stopping the explanation before it continued. "That much is clear." His tone remained controlled, but unmistakably disappointed. Marcus glanced quietly back toward the lobby where the students had gathered. The young woman from the staircase was now standing near the front of the small crowd, her expression shifting from confusion to sudden understanding. Her eyes widened slightly as the realization settled in. The second security officer stepped forward awkwardly. "Dr. Hale, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. We were following standard procedure." Marcus nodded gently, showing no anger at all. "I understand. You were doing your job." His calm response only deepened the uncomfortable silence inside the building. The dean looked at him again with quiet appreciation before speaking once more to the officers. "Procedure is important, but so is awareness. Tonight's lecture has been announced across the entire campus for weeks. The visiting scholar whose work helped build the artificial intelligence ethics program here should not be mistaken for someone who does not belong in his own university." The words carried across the marble floor and settled heavily over the listening crowd. A few students lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the scene they had been watching moments earlier. The professor stepped forward now, extending his hand toward Marcus. "Dr. Hale, I apologize as well. I should have recognized your name sooner." Marcus accepted the handshake politely. "No apology necessary. It has been several years since I last walked through these halls." The dean gestured toward the open doors of the lobby. Then let us correct that mistake immediately. He turned slightly toward the officers again. Please make sure Dr. Hale is escorted inside as our honored guest rather than outside as a stranger. The security officers stepped aside at once, clearing the doorway. Marcus walked calmly back across the threshold into Harrington Hall. As he stepped onto the marble floor, the gold university seal beneath his feet reflected the overhead lights once more, and the quiet crowd of students instinctively parted to give him space. The dean placed a respectful hand on Marcus's shoulder and spoke with quiet pride. Welcome back to the university, Dr. Hale. We have been waiting for you. Marcus Hale stepped fully back into Harrington Hall, and the atmosphere inside the building had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, the same space had been filled with suspicion and quiet judgment. Now the students standing along the staircase and near the tall pillars watched him with a different kind of attention. The marble floor reflected the soft ceiling lights as he walked beside the dean toward the center of the lobby. Conversations had stopped again, but this time the silence carried respect instead of doubt. The dean spoke calmly as they walked. It has been far too long since your last visit. The campus has changed quite a bit since you were last here. Marcus looked slowly around the hall. The tall banners were new. The polished floors looked brighter than he remembered. Even the scent of fresh wood polish drifting through the air felt different. He nodded thoughtfully. Some things change. Some things stay the same. The dean gave a quiet smile, as if he understood the deeper meaning behind the simple sentence. Behind them, the two security officers remained near the entrance, their earlier authority replaced by visible embarrassment. The first officer lowered his voice toward his partner. I should have recognized the name when he said it. The second officer exhaled slowly. Neither of them looked toward Marcus as he walked farther inside. Near the staircase, the young woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward slightly, her expression still thoughtful. She studied Marcus again, and now the memory that had been just out of reach finally surfaced clearly. She turned to the professor, standing beside her, and spoke in a low voice. That is him. I knew I had seen him somewhere. The professor looked at her with curiosity. Seen him where? The young woman gestured toward the banners hanging above the lobby. His photograph was on the announcement posters last week. He is the researcher who designed the ethics framework for the artificial intelligence systems they are teaching in our program. The professor nodded slowly as the realization settled across his face. That explains it. He glanced again toward Marcus with renewed respect. At the center of the lobby, the dean paused near the large university seal embedded in the marble floor. He looked down at the golden letters and then back at Marcus. Do you remember when this seal was installed? Marcus studied the floor for a moment. Yes, the year the new engineering wing opened. I was still a graduate student then. The dean nodded with satisfaction. Exactly. You stood in this very hall during the ceremony. You were the youngest student speaker the university had ever invited to address the faculty that year. Several students standing nearby exchanged surprised looks when they heard that. The idea that the quiet man they had just watched being escorted out had once stood here as a student speaker seemed almost unbelievable. Marcus did not react to their surprise. He simply watched the reflection of the lights across the polished floor as if the memory belonged to someone else. The dean turned toward the hallway that led to the lecture hall. Faculty members were beginning to gather near the entrance doors, waiting patiently for the evening event to begin. Some of them had already noticed Marcus and were whispering to one another. The dean gestured toward the corridor. They're eager to hear from you tonight. Your work has influenced more research here than you probably realize. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful nod. I hope it still deserves the attention. The dean laughed softly. It certainly does. As they began walking toward the lecture hall, a group of students quietly stepped aside to clear the path. The young woman from the staircase stood closest to the corridor now. When Marcus passed by, she spoke hesitantly. Dr. Hale. Marcus stopped and turned toward her with a calm expression. Yes. Her voice carried genuine curiosity. I am in the ethics program your research helped shape. I read your paper last semester. Marcus listened patiently as she continued. I just wanted to say thank you for the work you did. It changed how many of us think about technology. Marcus gave her a warm, respectful nod. That means more than you might think. The dean watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Then he gestured again toward the open doors of the lecture hall, where the audience was beginning to take their seats. Come along, Marcus. Tonight the university gets to hear the voice behind the ideas that started it all. The hallway leading to the lecture hall filled slowly with quiet movement as faculty members and students took their seats inside. The soft hum of conversation drifted out through the open doors while Marcus Hale and the dean approached the entrance together. The lights inside the lecture hall glowed warmly against the polished wooden walls, casting a calm academic atmosphere that felt very different from the tension that had filled the lobby only minutes earlier. Marcus paused briefly before entering, his eyes scanning the familiar architecture of the building. The curved ceiling beams, the rows of seats rising toward the back wall, and the tall projection screen at the front of the room all carried echoes of memories from years earlier. He had once sat among students in this same hall, listening quietly and wondering whether his own ideas would ever matter in a place like this. The dean noticed the pause and spoke softly. It feels different when you return after so many years, does not it? Marcus nodded slowly. It does. The dean gestured toward the front rows where several faculty members had already gathered. Word of Marcus Hale's arrival had spread quickly through the building, and the audience waiting inside the hall had grown larger than expected. Graduate students filled the middle rows while professors and visiting researchers gathered near the front. As Marcus stepped into the hall, a few heads turned in quiet recognition. Some people leaned toward their neighbors and whispered his name, while others studied him with the careful curiosity that often accompanies respected scholars whose work has shaped an entire field. The dean guided him toward the side of the stage where a small wooden podium stood beneath the bright lights. A projector hummed quietly nearby while a student assistant adjusted the microphone. The assistant glanced up when Marcus approached and quickly straightened. "Good evening, Dr. Hale. We were not sure when you would arrive." Marcus offered a polite nod. "I arrived just in time." The assistant smiled nervously and stepped aside. In the back rows, several students who had witnessed the earlier scene in the lobby had already taken seats. They watched Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The young woman who had recognized him earlier sat near the aisle with her notebook open, still processing the strange sequence of events that had unfolded before the lecture even began. The professor who had questioned the security officers sat beside her now, quietly reviewing the printed program for the evening event. The title of the lecture was displayed clearly at the top of the page: Ethical Boundaries in Artificial Intelligence Systems. Beneath the title appeared the name Dr. Marcus Hale. The professor shook his head slightly, still surprised by the earlier misunderstanding. At the side of the stage, the dean leaned closer to Marcus and spoke in a lower voice. "I regret the welcome you received when you arrived. That should not have happened." Marcus responded calmly. "It happens more often than people realize." The dean studied him for a moment, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. He nodded slowly. "Perhaps tonight will help remind everyone why you belong here." The audience inside the hall gradually settled into silence as the final students entered the room. The soft murmur of conversation faded until only the quiet hum of the projector remained. The dean stepped forward toward the podium and adjusted the microphone. The room grew completely still as he looked across the rows of students and faculty. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight." His voice carried clearly through the hall. "Tonight we have the honor of welcoming back someone whose work helped shape the foundation of the ethics program that many of you study today." A ripple of anticipation moved through the audience as he continued. "Years ago, this university welcomed a young graduate student whose ideas challenge how technology should be developed and how responsibility should guide innovation. Those ideas eventually influenced institutions far beyond this campus." He turned slightly toward Marcus, who waited quietly beside the stage lights. "Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcus Hale back to the university." The audience began to applaud as Marcus stepped slowly toward the podium, unaware that the lecture he was about to give would soon carry a message that no one in the room would easily forget. The applause inside the lecture hall rose slowly at first and then grew stronger as Marcus Hale stepped toward the podium. The sound echoed gently against the curved wooden ceiling before fading again as the audience settled back into their seats. Marcus placed his worn leather notebook on the podium and looked out across the room. Rows of students filled the middle section while faculty members and visiting researchers occupied the front seats. The soft glow of the overhead lights reflected in dozens of attentive faces. For a moment, Marcus simply stood there without speaking. His eyes moved slowly across the hall as though he were studying the room rather than preparing to address it. In the back rows, a few students who had witnessed the earlier moment in the lobby sat with quiet focus, still replaying the scene in their minds. The young woman who had recognized him earlier leaned slightly forward in her seat with her notebook open across her lap. Beside her, the professor adjusted his glasses and waited patiently for the lecture to begin. Marcus finally leaned closer to the microphone. His voice came through calm and steady. "Good evening, everyone. It has been many years since I last stood in this room." A faint smile passed across his face as he glanced toward the upper rows of the hall. "When I was a graduate student here, I usually sat somewhere in the back, trying to understand ideas that felt far bigger than my experience at the time." A few students smiled quietly at the remark. Marcus continued, "I never imagined that one day I would return to speak from the front of this stage." The dean stood to the side of the room, watching with quiet satisfaction. Marcus paused again and rested one hand lightly on the notebook. "Tonight, I was asked to speak about ethics in artificial intelligence systems. The technology that many of you are studying and building will shape decisions that affect millions of people. Machines may calculate faster than any human mind, but they still reflect the values of the people who designed them." The room remained completely silent as the audience listened. Marcus looked across the rows of students again before speaking more slowly. "When I first began studying artificial intelligence, I believed the most difficult challenge would be teaching machines how to think. Over time, I learned that the harder challenge is teaching people how to think responsibly about the tools they create." Several faculty members nodded slightly as he spoke. Marcus stepped away from the podium and began walking slowly across the front of the stage. The movement allowed his voice to carry naturally through the hall. Ethical systems are not built only with mathematics and programming languages. They are built with awareness. Awareness of bias. Awareness of assumptions. Awareness of who is included in the room when decisions are made and who is left outside the door. The words settled over the audience with quiet weight. In the back row, the young woman lowered her pen for a moment, sensing that the message carried more meaning than the simple lecture topic suggested. Marcus paused near the edge of the stage and looked toward the back of the hall. "Earlier this evening, I was reminded of something important before I even walked into this room." Several students exchanged curious glances at that statement. Marcus returned slowly to the podium. Sometimes the most powerful lesson about belonging happens before the lecture even begins. His eyes drifted briefly toward the doorway at the back of the hall, the same doorway where security officers had stood not long before. He did not explain further. Instead, he opened his notebook and continued speaking about the responsibility carried by engineers and researchers in shaping ethical systems for the future. The audience listened closely, unaware that the quiet moment he had just referenced would soon become the part of the evening they remembered the most. The lecture hall remained quiet after Marcus Hale spoke those last words. For several seconds, no one moved. The message about belonging hung in the air like a thought that needed time to settle. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the podium and looked across the audience again. His voice, when he continued, was calm, but carried a deeper weight now. When we design intelligent systems, we often focus on accuracy and efficiency. We measure how quickly a machine can process information or how precisely it can identify patterns. But there is another measurement that is harder to quantify. He paused for a moment and allowed his eyes to move slowly across the room. That measurement is fairness. Several students began writing quickly in their notebooks. Marcus continued speaking in the same steady tone. A system may be technically correct and still produce unjust results if the people who build it fail to question their assumptions. Technology reflects the values of the environment in which it is created. If that environment ignores certain voices, then the system will also ignore them. The young woman sitting near the aisle felt a quiet chill move through her as she listened. She remembered the moment earlier in the lobby when Marcus had been guided toward the exit. The professor beside her shifted slightly in his chair, realizing that the lecture had taken a direction he had not expected. Marcus stepped away from the podium again and walked slowly across the stage. The wooden floor beneath his shoes carried a soft echo through the hall. Years ago, I wrote a paper that many of you have read in your program. It discussed how artificial intelligence systems inherit human bias when the designers fail to question the limits of their perspective. That idea was theoretical when I first presented it. Today, it is becoming a practical reality. He turned slightly toward the large screen behind him where the title of the lecture glowed under the projector light. Ethical systems must begin with awareness. Awareness of who is present when decisions are made. Awareness of who is missing. He stopped near the edge of the stage again and looked toward the back of the room. Earlier this evening, I experienced a small example of how easily assumptions can shape our judgment. The audience shifted quietly. The students who had been in the lobby knew exactly what he was referring to, but most of the hall did not. Marcus continued speaking without raising his voice. When someone enters a place where they're not expected to be, the human mind fills the gap in information with the quickest explanation available. Sometimes that explanation is correct. Sometimes it is not. The room remained silent as the message settled deeper. Marcus returned to the podium and opened his notebook again, although he did not look down at the pages. The purpose of ethical design is not only to teach machines how to make decisions. It is also to remind people to slow down before making their own judgments. In the back row, the two security officers who had escorted him earlier had quietly taken seats after the dean invited them to attend the lecture. They sat still now, listening carefully to every word. Marcus looked across the audience once more before finishing the thought. A responsible system does not assume that someone standing in the wrong place must be a mistake. Instead, it asks a better question. What information might we be missing? The hall remained completely silent for several seconds before a few quiet murmurs of agreement moved through the audience. The dean standing near the wall folded his arms and nodded slowly. He understood that the lecture had just turned into something more powerful than a discussion about technology. It had become a lesson about the way people see one another before they take the time to truly understand. The lecture hall remained completely silent after Marcus Hale finished that sentence. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It felt reflective, like the entire room was slowly turning the idea over in their minds. Marcus rested his hands on the podium again and allowed the moment to breathe. The projector behind him hummed softly, and the warm light from the stage lamps spread across the wooden floor. In the middle rows, several students exchanged thoughtful glances. Some of them were no longer writing notes. They were simply listening. Marcus lifted his eyes toward the back of the room, where the two security officers sat quietly among the audience. Their uniforms stood out slightly against the rows of students, yet they did not try to hide or shift in their seats. They listened just like everyone else. Marcus spoke again, his voice calm and measured. Many people believe that ethical thinking is something reserved for philosophers or policymakers. In reality, it begins with small, everyday choices. The decision to pause before drawing a conclusion. The decision to ask a second question instead of accepting the first assumption. He stepped away from the podium again and walked slowly across the front of the stage. When we design intelligent systems, we often build safeguards that prevent the machine from acting on incomplete information. We create checks that force the system to review its own conclusions before it takes action. He paused and looked across the audience. Humans could benefit from the same kind of discipline. A few quiet laughs moved through the hall, not mocking, but understanding. Marcus gave a small smile before continuing. Earlier tonight, I was reminded that the human mind moves very quickly when it believes it recognizes a pattern. Someone enters a place where they are not expected to be. The mind fills the gap. A conclusion appears almost instantly. The audience remained focused on every word. The professor who had spoken in the lobby earlier leaned forward slightly in his seat, his expression thoughtful. Marcus returned to the podium and placed one hand gently on the worn leather notebook resting there. The truth is that assumptions often feel logical in the moment. They follow patterns we have seen before. But patterns can be incomplete. They can leave out details that matter. He glanced briefly toward the back of the hall again before continuing. The most responsible systems are the ones that pause long enough to ask whether the pattern might be wrong. The young woman sitting near the aisle looked down at her notebook again. She wrote one sentence slowly before lifting her eyes back toward the stage. Marcus allowed another brief silence to settle across the hall before he spoke again. There's another lesson hidden inside that idea. Responsibility does not belong only to the designers of technology. It belongs to anyone who chooses to think carefully before acting. His voice softened slightly as he added the final thought. Respect often begins with curiosity. When we choose to ask who someone is instead of deciding who they must be, we create space for understanding. In the back row, the first security officer lowered his gaze for a moment, reflecting on the events that had unfolded in the lobby earlier. The dean, standing near the wall, watched the audience carefully. He could see the shift in the room. The lecture had become more than an academic discussion. It had become a quiet mirror held up to everyone listening. Marcus closed his notebook gently and looked across the audience once more. Tonight, I was invited to speak about ethical systems and technology. But the truth is that the most important system we will ever improve is the one that guides our own judgment. The hall remained silent again for several seconds. Then a single student near the middle rows began to applaud softly. The sound spread slowly through the room until the entire audience joined in, the applause rising not from excitement, but from genuine understanding. The applause continued for several moments after Marcus Hale finished speaking. It rolled across the lecture hall like a quiet wave of recognition rather than excitement. Students looked at one another with thoughtful expressions, while several faculty members nodded slowly in agreement. Marcus remained at the podium, his posture calm, waiting patiently as the sound gradually faded. When the room finally grew quiet again, the dean stepped forward from the side of the stage and approached the microphone. His voice carried the composed authority that everyone in the room recognized. "Thank you, Dr. Hale. That was not only a lecture about technology. It was a reminder about responsibility." The dean turned slightly toward the audience before continuing. "This university has always believed that knowledge should challenge us to become better thinkers and better people. Tonight we were reminded that those two goals are often the same thing." The audience listened attentively as he paused. Earlier this evening, something happened in the lobby of Harrington Hall. Many of you were not there to see it, but it reflects exactly the kind of lesson Dr. Hale just described. Several students shifted in their seats with curiosity. Those who had witnessed the moment exchanged quiet glances. The dean continued in the same calm tone. When Dr. Hale arrived at the building, he was briefly mistaken for someone who did not belong here. The words were spoken without accusation, yet the meaning was clear enough for everyone to understand. A few people in the audience looked toward the back rows where the two security officers sat quietly. The dean did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with measured honesty. The situation was handled quickly once it became clear who he was. But the important point is not the misunderstanding itself. The important point is the lesson behind it. Marcus stood beside the podium with his hands loosely folded while the dean continued. Institutions like this university exist to expand knowledge. But knowledge grows only when we remain willing to question our assumptions. When we fail to ask questions, we risk limiting the very understanding we claim to value. The room remained silent as the message settled across the audience. The dean turned slightly toward Marcus and offered a respectful nod before speaking again. Dr. Hale returned tonight not only as a scholar whose research has shaped the ethics program here. He also returned as someone who once walked these halls as a student searching for his place in the academic world. A soft murmur moved through the audience as several students imagined that younger version of Marcus sitting in the same lecture hall years earlier. The dean continued. His work has influenced universities and research institutions across the country. But perhaps the most valuable contribution he offers is the reminder that progress begins with awareness. Awareness of how we see one another. Awareness of how quickly assumptions can guide our actions. He stepped back from the microphone and gestured toward Marcus. Marcus responded with a small nod before stepping forward once more. His voice was quiet but clear. Every place of learning has moments that test whether its values are truly practiced. Tonight, this university passed that test because people were willing to pause and listen. The dean extended his hand, and Marcus shook it with calm gratitude. The audience rose slowly to their feet as another round of applause filled the hall, this time louder and more unified than before. The sound carried a sense of shared understanding. The students who had watched the scene in the lobby earlier now understood why that small moment had become part of the lesson they would remember long after the lecture ended. The applause inside the lecture hall continued long after Marcus Hale and the dean stepped away from the podium. Students and professors remained standing, not because they were required to, but because the moment carried a quiet weight that no one seemed eager to break. Marcus looked across the room one more time, his expression calm and thoughtful. Years earlier, he had once sat in the back row of this same hall as an uncertain graduate student. Now, he stood at the front of the room with hundreds of eyes watching him. Yet the memory of that earlier version of himself remained clear. Slowly, the audience began to settle back into their seats. Conversations returned in soft murmurs as people reflected on the lecture. A group of students near the front approached the stage, each carrying notebooks filled with careful notes. One of them spoke first, her voice respectful but curious. "Dr. Hale, thank you for the lecture tonight. It made me realize how easily people trust the decisions of machines without questioning the people behind them." Marcus nodded gently. That is exactly why ethical thinking matters. Technology will only be as responsible as the people who build it. The students thanked him again before returning to their seats. Nearby, the professor who had spoken in the lobby earlier approached with a thoughtful expression. "I want to apologize once more for what happened when you arrived. I should have recognized your name sooner." Marcus shook his head calmly. "You asked a question instead of making a judgment. That is more than most people do." The professor gave a quiet nod, understanding the meaning behind those words. Across the room, the two security officers stood near the back exit, waiting respectfully until the crowd thinned. When the last group of students finished speaking with Marcus, they slowly approached the stage. The first officer cleared his throat before speaking. "Dr. Hale, I want to apologize for earlier this evening. We believed we were following procedure, but we should have taken more time to understand the situation." Marcus looked at both men with the same calm expression he had shown all evening. Procedures exist for a reason, but awareness matters too. The officer nodded, grateful that the conversation carried no anger. The dean stepped forward beside Marcus and addressed them kindly. Tonight became a lesson for all of us. The important thing is that we learn from it. The officers thanked him and quietly left the hall. Outside, the evening air had cooled and the campus lights glowed softly across the walkways. Back inside the lecture hall, the final students gathered their books and prepared to leave. The young woman who had recognized Marcus earlier approached the stage once more. She spoke with a thoughtful smile. "Dr. Hale, I will remember what you said tonight about curiosity and respect." Marcus nodded. "Keep asking questions. That is how understanding grows." When she walked away, the hall finally became quiet again. Marcus looked toward the back rows where he had once sat as a student years before. The dean stood beside him with a quiet smile. "You returned tonight and reminded this university what it means to truly see someone." Marcus picked up his worn leather notebook from the podium. The reflection of the stage lights shimmered across the polished wood floor as he turned toward the exit. At the doorway, he paused for a brief moment and looked back across the empty lecture hall. Then he spoke one final sentence, softly enough that only the dean standing beside him could hear. Sometimes the place that questions whether you belong is the very place where your voice is needed most. With that quiet thought, Marcus Hale stepped into the hallway, and the doors of the lecture hall closed behind him, leaving the lesson of that evening echoing far beyond the walls of the university.